The summer sun beat down on Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered in excited clusters, their cameras clicking away at the magnificent building and its iconic guardsman. Among these proud protectors stood a young royal guard, his posture perfect and his uniform immaculate, every button gleaming under the bright London sky. He'd dreamed of this position since childhood, watching the changing of the guard ceremonies on TV with his grandmother. Now, after 5 years of military service and countless hours of training, he'd earned his place among these elite servicemen. Each morning, he took extra care pressing his uniform, ensuring every plate was razor-sharp and every surface spotless. His boots shone like mirrors, reflecting his dedication to duty. The day had started like any other. He'd arrived early at the barracks, joining his fellow guardsmen for morning inspection. They'd marched out to their posts with the precision that made tourists stop and stare in wonder. The weight of his ceremonial bearskin cap was familiar now, though the summer heat made it a challenge he bore with dignity. Around him, visitors from all corners of the world gathered, speaking in different languages and accents. Children pointed excitedly, tugging at their parents' sleeves. "Look at how still he stands." They'd whisper, some trying to make him smile or move. But he remained professional, his eyes focused ahead, embodying centuries of royal tradition. A group of schoolchildren on a field trip caught his peripheral vision. Their teacher explained the history of the Royal Guard, and he felt a surge of pride hearing about the legacy he now represented. Some of the kids waved at him, and though his expression remained stoic, their enthusiasm warmed his heart. Throughout the morning, he'd heard countless camera clicks and watched as tourists posed beside him for photos. An elderly couple from Japan bowed respectfully before taking their picture. A family from Brazil shared excited whispers about his uniform. A young girl from Canada stood in awe, telling her mother she wanted to be a soldier too. He'd learned to read the crowds during his months of service. Most visitors were respectful, maintaining their distance behind the barriers. They admired the tradition, taking photos and speaking in hushed, reverent tones about the history they were witnessing. Some tried to provoke reactions, a natural part of the job he'd grown used to handling with patience. The morning crowd had begun to thin as lunchtime approached. The summer breeze carried the distant sounds of London traffic, mixed with the cheerful chatter of tourists and the occasional clip-clop of the mounted police doing their rounds. Everything felt routine, ordinary, just another day at one of the world's most famous palaces. Little did he know that this ordinary day was about to become extraordinary. As he continued his watch, maintaining his ceremonial stance with practiced ease, he didn't realize he was about to face a situation that would test not just his training, but his character and composure in ways he never expected. The shadows were beginning to shift as noon approached, bringing with them a new wave of visitors. Among them was someone who would turn this ordinary day into one that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. But for now, the Royal Guard simply stood his post, proud and dignified, doing what he'd been trained to do: protect and represent the crown with honor. The afternoon crowd at Buckingham Palace had grown larger, a mix of excited tourists taking photos and families enjoying the sunny day. The air was filled with the cheerful buzz of different languages and the click of cameras, but something was about to disturb this peaceful scene. A loud voice cut through the pleasant atmosphere, making several nearby tourists turn their heads. A man in his 40s, wearing an expensive but rumpled suit, was speaking far too loudly into his phone. His American accent carried clearly across the courtyard as he complained about London's weather, the food, and now, increasingly, about the people around him. The man's behavior showed clear signs that he'd had too much to drink, even though it was barely afternoon. He stumbled slightly as he walked, bumping into other tourists without apologizing. A young couple quickly moved their children away from him, exchanging worried glances. Two teenage girls whispered to each other and hurried past, clutching their bags closer. At first, his comments were just annoying, the typical grumbling of an unhappy tourist. But as he got closer to the guard's post, his words took on an uglier tone. He began making remarks about the guard's skin color, each comment more offensive than the last. Other tourists started to look uncomfortable, some shooting sympathetic glances at the guard, while others pretended not to hear. A middle-aged woman in a floral dress tried to intervene. "Sir," she said firmly, "that kind of language isn't appropriate here." but the man just laughed and waved her off, his movements becoming more exaggerated. Her husband gently pulled her back, whispering that it wasn't worth getting involved. The guard remained perfectly still, his training evident in every line of his body. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, his posture remained impeccable, but anyone watching closely might have noticed his grip tighten slightly on his ceremonial rifle. Years of military discipline showed in his ability to maintain composure despite the growing tension. Other tourists began to film the scene on their phones, perhaps sensing that something was about to happen. A group of schoolchildren on a field trip were quickly shepherded away by their worried teachers. The usually cheerful atmosphere around the palace had turned tense and uncomfortable. The man's voice grew louder as his confidence seemed to increase with each step. He started pointing at the guard, making exaggerated gestures and encouraging others to join in his mockery. But the crowd backed away instead, creating a visible space between themselves and the troublemaker. A palace security guard in a dark suit appeared at the edge of the scene, speaking quietly into his radio. He began making his way through the crowd, but before he could reach the drunk tourist, things took an even darker turn. The man's attention was now fully focused on the royal guard. He began a stream of racial slurs, each word more venomous than the last. Some tourists gasped, others turned away, and a few brave souls tried to shush him, but he seemed beyond caring about the reaction of others, his face reddened with drink and anger. The security barriers that kept tourists at a safe distance suddenly didn't seem strong enough. The man was swaying on his feet, but his eyes had taken on a determined look that suggested he wasn't finished. His hand clutched an empty water bottle, crushing it in his growing anger. As the tension in the air built to breaking point, time seemed to slow down. The drunk tourist took one step closer to the barrier, then another. The crowd held its collective breath, knowing they were about to witness something unprecedented. The question wasn't if something would happen, but when, and how bad it would be. Time seemed to slow down as the drunk tourist grabbed the security barrier with both hands. The metal rattled ominously, drawing gasps from the crowd. A mother quickly pulled her young son behind her, while others backed away, creating a widening circle around the unfolding scene. "You can't ignore me forever," the tourist sneered, his words slurring together. His expensive watch glinted in the sunlight as he pointed accusingly at the guard. The guard remained motionless, his training evident in every line of his perfectly straight posture. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, though his jaw might have tightened slightly under his ceremonial bearskin cap. Two palace security guards were now moving through the crowd, their black suits stark against the colorful tourist clothing. But they were still too far away when the tourist made his move. In one sudden motion, he'd hoisted himself over the barrier, his polished leather shoes scraping against the metal as he stumbled onto the restricted side. Several phones were recording now, their owners both horrified and transfixed by what they were witnessing. An elderly gentleman stepped forward, his voice firm but calm. "Sir, please step back. You're making a terrible mistake." The tourist responded with a dismissive wave, nearly losing his balance in the process. The guard gave the traditional warning, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of military tradition. "Step back, sir." The command rang out clear and professional, echoing off the palace walls. It was the guard's first movement since the confrontation began, but the tourist only laughed. "Oh, so now you can talk." The tourist mocked, taking another stumbling step forward. His tie was loose, his suit jacket rumpled, and his face was red with both alcohol and anger. "What are you going to do about it?" The crowd watched in tense silence as the tourist crossed the point of no return. He was now within arm's reach of the guard, close enough that everyone could smell the alcohol on his breath. His hands were balled into fists, knuckles white with rage. "You don't belong here," the tourist spat out, each word dripping with prejudice. "Your kind shouldn't be." His words were cut short as he reached for the guard's uniform, his fingers just brushing the bright red fabric. In that moment, the guard had a choice to make. His training covered this situation, but theory and practice were different things. Behind his stoic expression, years of military discipline warred with natural human reaction. A small child in the crowd buried his face in his father's leg, unable to watch. An older woman clutched her husband's arm, her knuckles white. The security guards were running now, but they wouldn't make it in time. The tourist's hand made contact with the guard's chest, grabbing at the pristine uniform. Time seemed to crystallize in that moment. The tourist's triumphant sneer, the guard's unwavering gaze, the collective intake of breath from the crowd. What happened next would be replayed thousands of times on social media, but none of the videos could quite capture the electric tension of that moment. The guard's next action would either uphold or break centuries of tradition, and everyone present knew they were witnessing a moment that would be talked about for years to come. The tourist pulled back his other hand, clearly intending to escalate the situation further. The crowd's horrified gasps mixed with the distant sound of running footsteps as the security team rushed to intervene. But they all knew they would be too late to prevent what was about to happen. What happened next was so fast that many tourists would later say they had to watch their phone recordings in slow motion to understand it. The guard's movement was fluid, precise, and controlled, the result of countless hours of military training. As the tourist's fist came forward, the guard's ceremonial rifle shifted slightly. In one smooth motion, he stepped aside, using the tourist's own momentum against him. The drunk man's wild swing met nothing but air, throwing him off balance. The guard's free hand moved with surgical precision, grabbing the tourist's wrist and redirecting his movement. The next few seconds were a masterclass in professional restraint. The guard didn't throw a single punch or use any excessive force. Instead, he simply guided the tourist's own momentum downward, using a standard military hold that any of his fellow servicemen would recognize from their training. The tourist's expensive suit met the ground with a thud that seemed to echo across the suddenly silent courtyard. His face showed pure shock. Clearly, this wasn't how he'd expected things to go. The guard held him firmly but carefully, applying just enough pressure to keep him still without causing any harm. "Release me," the tourist spluttered, his face red with embarrassment now rather than anger. But the guard wasn't taking any chances. He maintained the hold, professional and controlled, while speaking clearly into his radio to summon assistance. The crowd, which had been holding its collective breath, suddenly erupted in applause. A young boy tugged at his father's sleeve, whispering excitedly, "Did you see that?" He didn't even drop his rifle. Several tourists were still filming, their phones capturing every moment of this unexpected display of skill and restraint. The palace security team arrived seconds later, taking in the scene with professional efficiency. The guard smoothly handed over control to them, stepping back into his post with the same precision he'd shown in the takedown. His uniform was still perfectly pressed, his posture impeccable, as if he hadn't just dealt with a dangerous situation. Two security officers helped the tourist to his feet, now handling a much more subdued man than the one who'd caused such a scene moments before. The anger had drained from his face, replaced by a mix of shame and disbelief. His previously pristine suit was now dusty, his tie completely askew. An older gentleman in the crowd was explaining to his grandchildren how the guard's response had been textbook perfect, minimum force, maximum control. "That's what real training looks like," he said, his voice carrying pride for a service member he'd never met. No violence, no drama, just pure professionalism. The tourist was now standing, supported by the security team, his previous bravado completely gone. He avoided looking at anyone as they led him away, especially the guard who had so efficiently countered his attack. His stumbling walk was no longer from alcohol alone, but from the shock of having his worldview so thoroughly shaken. Throughout the crowd, people were sharing what they'd captured on their phones, pointing out details to each other. "Did you see how he never lost his composure? Look at how careful he was not to hurt him." The general consensus was clear. They had witnessed something remarkable, a perfect example of power controlled by discipline. The guard remained at his post, his eyes forward, his posture perfect, as if nothing unusual had happened. But there was a subtle change in how the crowd looked at him now. The respect in their eyes had deepened, understanding that beneath the ceremonial uniform stood a highly trained professional who had just provided a masterclass in controlled response to provocation. The atmosphere around Buckingham Palace had transformed completely. Where there had been tension and fear just moments before, now there was a buzz of excitement and relief. Tourists spoke in animated whispers, replaying what they'd witnessed to newcomers who were just arriving at the scene. Police officers had arrived to support the palace security team. their fluorescent yellow jackets bright against the palace's stone walls. They'd moved through the crowd with notebooks out, gathering statements from witnesses. Many tourists eagerly showed their phone recordings, each clip capturing the incident from different angles. A group of schoolchildren who had been hurried away during the confrontation were now allowed to return, their teacher using the moment as an impromptu lesson about respect and consequences. "See how the guard handled that situation," she explained quietly to her wide-eyed students. "That's what we call professionalism." The tourist who had caused the scene was now sitting in a palace security office, looking much smaller than he had earlier. His expensive suit was dusty, his previous arrogance replaced by visible shame as he answered questions from the authorities. Several witnesses had come forward to give statements, including an off-duty nurse who had been standing nearby throughout the incident. Back at the guard's post, something remarkable was happening. People were approaching the barrier one by one, each showing their respect in different ways. An elderly veteran gave a crisp salute. A young girl left a small bouquet of flowers she'd been carrying. A family from Japan bowed deeply before taking their photos. The guard maintained his professional stance, but the atmosphere around him had changed. The typical tourist photos continued, but now they were taken with a new sense of reverence. Parents lifted their children up for better views, explaining in hushed voices about the importance of standing up to bullies while staying professional. Social media was already buzzing with videos of the incident. Tourists who had captured the moment were sharing their footage, and comments were pouring in from around the world. Many praised the guard's restraint and professionalism, while others shared their own stories of facing similar prejudice with dignity. A senior palace official had emerged to speak with several journalists who had arrived at the scene. His words were measured but clear. The royal guard showed exemplary restraint and professionalism in handling an unfortunate situation. This kind of behavior towards our guards will not be tolerated. The police were particularly interested in one witness's statement, an international law professor who happened to be visiting from Canada. She explained to the officers how the guard had used textbook perfect defensive techniques, emphasizing that he had used minimum necessary force despite severe provocation. Throughout all this activity, the guard remained at his post, his posture perfect, his dedication unwavering. If anything, he stood a little straighter now, though few would have thought that possible. The sun had shifted in the sky, casting long shadows across the palace grounds, but his focus never wavered. Other guards at their posts around the palace had heard about the incident through their radio communications. There was a subtle pride in their bearing now. Their colleague had demonstrated to the world what they all trained for, showing that beneath their ceremonial uniforms were highly skilled professionals. As the afternoon wore on, the incident became a topic of discussion among the passing tourists. The story grew with each retelling, though the actual footage showed something more impressive, a perfect example of training, discipline, and professionalism in the face of hatred. It was clear to everyone that this day would be remembered as more than just another tourist incident at Buckingham Palace. The next morning, newspapers across London splashed the story across their front pages. The videos had gone viral overnight, with millions of views and thousands of supportive comments. News channels played the footage on repeat, experts analyzing the guard's perfect technique and remarkable restraint. Inside the London magistrate's court, the tourist sat quietly in his rumpled designer suit, a stark contrast to his behavior the day before. His lawyer had advised him to plead guilty to all charges: assault, racial harassment, and breaching protected security zones. The evidence against him was overwhelming, with dozens of video recordings from different angles showing his actions clearly. The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom as she delivered her verdict. "Your actions were not just an attack on an individual," she stated firmly, "but an assault on the values we hold dear as a society." The tourist kept his eyes fixed on the floor as she listed his penalties: a substantial fine, a suspended sentence, and a ban from approaching all royal properties for life. Back at Buckingham Palace, the guard's commanding officer had called a special meeting. The guard stood at attention as his superior commended his actions, noting how his response would be used as a teaching example in future training. "You've shown the world what the Royal Guard truly stands for," the officer said, his voice filled with pride. The incident sparked important conversations across the country. Radio shows were flooded with callers sharing their own experiences of facing discrimination with dignity. Social media platforms were full of stories from other service members, both active and retired, about similar situations they'd faced and how they'd handled them. In the Parliament building at Westminster, MPs discussed the incident during a session about public security. They praised the Guards' professionalism while debating new measures to protect service members from harassment. This incident has shown us that our Guardsmen face more than just tourist curiosity, one MP noted. They need our full support and protection. The tourist's own company, a large international firm, released a statement distancing themselves from his actions. They announced his immediate resignation and pledged a substantial donation to organizations fighting racial discrimination. The values displayed in that incident do not reflect our company's principles, their statement read. The Guards' response had become a training video not just for military personnel, but for security forces around the world. Professional security experts praised his technique, pointing out how he had protected himself while using minimum force. This is exactly how we want our personnel to handle provocations, a senior police trainer explained in a television interview. Letters of support poured into the palace from around the globe. Veterans wrote to express their pride, children sent drawings, and citizens from all walks of life shared messages of encouragement. One letter from a young security officer in training said simply, "You've shown us all how to stand tall in the face of hatred." The tourist's victim's impact statement was read in court, describing how the incident had affected him. "I've had time to reflect on my actions," it read, "and I'm deeply ashamed. I've learned that a uniform does not make someone less human. If anything, it shows their commitment to serving others despite people like me." A week after the incident, a small ceremony was held at the palace. The Guard received a commendation for his actions, though few outside the military would ever know about it. The Royal Guard's tradition of quiet professionalism remained unchanged. His fellow Guardsmen showed their respect in subtle ways. A crisper salute during changing of the Guard, a prouder bearing on patrol. The most meaningful response, however, came from the daily tourists at the palace. People from all backgrounds now approached the Guards with increased respect, understanding that beneath those ceremonial uniforms stood highly trained professionals who deserved their admiration. The incident had turned an ugly moment into a powerful lesson about dignity, professionalism, and the importance of standing firm against prejudice. 1 year after the incident, its effects were still rippling through society like waves in a pond. The viral video had become more than just another internet sensation. It had turned into a powerful teaching tool about respect, dignity, and professional response to prejudice. At the Royal Military Academy, new recruits watched the footage during their training. Their instructor, a veteran with 20 years of service, would pause the video at key moments. "Notice the Guard's restraint," he'd point out. "He had every right to be angry, but he chose professionalism. That's the standard we expect from every one of you." The incident had sparked real changes in how tourist sites protected their staff. Buckingham Palace had installed clearer barriers and posted new signs explaining the serious consequences of harassing the Guards. Other historic sites across London had followed suit, implementing similar measures to protect their personnel from abuse. In police academies across the world, the video became part of their training curriculum. "This is perfect technique," trainers would explain, showing how the Guard had defended himself without escalating the situation. No excessive force, no loss of control, just pure professional response to a threat. The Guard himself had received hundreds of letters from people inspired by his actions. A young security officer from Manchester wrote about how the video had helped him handle a similar situation with the same professional calm. A teacher in Birmingham shared how she used the story to teach her students about standing up to bullies while keeping their dignity. Schools began incorporating the incident into their lessons about respect and diversity. The Guard didn't just defend himself, one teacher explained to her class. He showed us all how to face hatred with dignity. Students would discuss how they could apply the same principles of restraint and professionalism in their own lives. Tourist behavior at the palace had changed noticeably. Visitors now approached the Guards with more respect, understanding that beneath the ceremonial uniforms were highly trained professionals deserving of their consideration. Parents would explain to their children about the importance of respectful behavior, often referring to the incident as a lesson in what not to do. The tourist who had caused the scene had become an unexpected advocate for change. After completing a court-mandated anti-discrimination program, he began speaking at corporate events about his transformation. "I was wrong in every possible way," he would tell audiences. "That guard taught me more about dignity in 30 seconds than I'd learned in my entire life." Military recruitment saw an interesting trend in the months following the incident. More young people cited the guard's professionalism as their inspiration for joining. "I want to learn that kind of self-control," one recruit explained during his interview. "That's real strength, staying professional no matter what." The video continued to resurface on social media, especially when discussions about handling discrimination arose. Comments would pour in from around the world, praising the guard's response and sharing similar stories of maintaining dignity under pressure. It had become a touchstone for conversations about professional response to prejudice. A documentary filmmaker captured some of these lasting changes in a short film about the incident's impact. She interviewed tourists, military personnel, and security experts, all sharing how this brief encounter had influenced their understanding of professionalism and respect. The film ended with a powerful shot of the guard's post at sunset, symbolizing how one moment of professionalism had cast such a long shadow. Beyond all the formal changes and training programs, perhaps the most significant impact was the subtle shift in public consciousness. The incident had shown that true strength lies not in aggression or retaliation, but in maintaining dignity and professionalism even under the worst provocations. It served as a powerful reminder that sometimes the strongest response to hatred is simply standing your ground with unwavering dignity.